Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
So a lot of times our prejudices or the things we are against simply occur because we have no experience with them, and it's hard to imagine them ahead of time.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Ernie Sibley, vestry member of Trinity Episcopal Church in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections is the consecration of Barbara Harris, psychological considerations. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Ernie, the ordination or consecration as a bishop of Barbara Harris in the Episcopal Church has gotten a lot of media attention and I think grabbed people's attention in various ways. We've had some remarkably diverse responses to the whole thing. It's been something that has been newsworthy because it really is an historical event. It's the first time that we have had a woman bishop in any of the churches who think of the bishops as successors to the apostles. And that's a 2,000-year period dominated by males, and now suddenly we have a woman in the inner circle, moving up in the leadership ranks. It's good to point out, I suppose, that Barbara Harris is a suffragan bishop in the state of Massachusetts. I take it that the Episcopal Church in the United States diocese generally corresponds with state boundaries, at least
no,
in Ohio
not necessarily.
and Massachusetts, that's the case.
No, not in Ohio, believe
really?
it or not. The northern part of the state is called the Diocese of Ohio, and then the southern part of the state, Columbus and South, is called the Diocese of Southern Ohio.
Oh, well, I'm glad you clarified that. Why don't you say a little bit more about how that breaks down around the country?
I think there are something like, and this is a guess, a couple of hundred dioceses in the United States. There are more bishops than that because several dioceses have two bishops, a suffragan bishop and another bishop, or a bishop and assistant bishop who just helps out with the pastoral load.
I think it's good to point out at this point that you are a member of the Episcopal Church, what we commonly call a layperson in that church, but one who's extremely knowledgeable about what goes on, and that's why I want to talk to you about the Barbara Harris consecration. But I hope I didn't interrupt your train of thought.
No, not at all.
But
I suspect the people of Massachusetts who elected Barbara really are startled and amazed by all the worldwide furor they've created, because I really doubt if that was their intention or that was an issue when they did their voting.
However, it would be hard to get away from the fact that a first always makes a splash, and especially in the United States, the first of anything is usually newsworthy, and we give it a lot of attention, and it would be hard to miss the point that this is a great change in the whole history of the way the Christian church has functioned. I'm not saying that it will make a tremendous difference to begin with. I mean, I see it as a first step in a long process. I mean, Barbara Harris, although she is a very liberal bent and has been associated with liberal causes like the fight against racism and sexism throughout her rather brief career as a clergy person in the Anglican Communion, while she does have those kind of credentials and outlook, she is not going to transform the structure of the Anglican hierarchy. And we're not going to see a major change as a result of her presence. I think the larger significance is that it begins us thinking about the whole structure of the church. It gets us thinking about the potential value of having women involved in the church at higher levels. And it forces us to think again, I think, about what leadership is and what characteristics and qualities we want leaders to have in the church. I think biblically we want to move, I think, towards a greater servant kind of role. So I think I see it as significant in terms of us forcing us to rethink, perhaps changing consciousness on the part of some people, and of then trying to get more women into these kind of positions. It's not going to be any good if she's a token and we've got one woman 20 years from now in the Anglican hierarchy and we've made no other progress.
Exactly. The Episcopal Church in America has been going through grappling with the feminist issues since 1974, which is when we started ordaining women to the priesthood in the Episcopal Church. It's been a continuing process. For instance, in the Diocese of Ohio, our diocese right now, we're going through training on inclusive language, and a commission is working in New York City regularly to attempt to create and submit revisions in our normal liturgy, our Nicene or Apostles' Creed, for instance, the Lord's Prayer, to make the language less offensive to some and generally less sexist and more inclusive. So this process of sensitizing people to the issues and, as you say, getting them to examine who they are, what their church stands for, and where they want to go from here is a continuing and, I suspect, a very painful issue for a lot of people. Emotionally, it's difficult to deal with the change in our world in the last 10 years. As Brian Hare discussed, the priest you had at the John Courtney Murray lecture at the university a couple of weeks ago, the changes, what technology has enabled us to do in the last 5, 10, 15 years. I think he put it in terms of only God used to be able to create life, and only God could wipe us all out in an instant, and now we have that capability ourselves. So self-examination, examination of our institutions, and all of the pain that goes with making changes, all of my buried bigotry and certainties and rigidities are brought out on the table, and I'm forced to examine them. I think we'll have no way really of getting into people's attitudes, their basic gut attitudes on the Barbara Harris issue. I'm not sure they willingly want to confront the whole issue. Well, now they have it in front of them. We have it, I have it in front of me. And as you say, it opens it up for me to take a look at who I am, what it means to belong to a church, and where do we go from here.
That's well said, Ernie, and I think that it's worthy of pursuing that line of thought. I mean, there's many ways to look at this thing about Barbara Harris. There are theological considerations. I mean, it takes us back to the biblical tradition and how we understand the fact that Jesus ordained only men as the original 12, and we had only male apostles, and we've had a long tradition of only males in leadership positions. So there's many theological issues that need to be confronted in all of this, and the theologians are going to be battling that out, and the Scripture scholars will be a very important part of it. I must say, just to summarize some of that many of the liberal scholars these days believe there are no biblical or theological reasons why women should not be ordained priests and a fortiori be consecrated as bishops as well. So that we need to look at those theological issues that are there. But what you have raised, I think, is something that maybe people understand better, and that really is the psychological issues that are involved and the way people respond to the consecration of Barbara Harris. So I think we need to look at this a little more closely. And I must say that on the very day that we were talking about it, so shortly afterwards, I was talking to a young man who really was very opposed to it. A young man who I suppose would be thought of as being quite liberal in many ways. But in this church matter, he was happened to be a Catholic, and he really didn't like this idea, and he shared some of his feelings about this. That he didn't like women preaching in general. He didn't feel good when women were getting up and giving sermons in the church. I've heard Catholics say that they didn't want to go to confession to women. And I've heard women talk like that women did not want to see other women up there presiding at the altar, that simply wasn't correct. So you begin to see a broad range of responses. On the other hand, we've got other people who are applauding this thing of Barbara Harris and saying this is marvelous, it's a step forward, and I love to see a woman in leadership roles, and they're hoping she does well and that she's going to bring a certain openness and inclusivity and certain compassion to her role as a bishop that will be a good model for other bishops. So there's other people who are just on the opposite side. They look at this culture of the United States and say, well, women are precisely in good position to be pastors, that a lot of the distinctive experience that women have in raising children, in nurturing, and so on, is the kind of thing that we want pastors to have, and that they would be not just adequate pastors, but may prove to be very effective ones. Now, there's a lot of things that have to be talked about in those positions, and to look at more carefully, but I'm just trying to describe what I see as sort of popular reactions.
Exactly. I have to wonder, a number of the issues you're bringing up, your young man that you talked to who was upset by it, one has to wonder what our pastoral responsibilities are, your responsibilities, and your responses as a priest, my responsibilities as a layperson in terms of helping other people talk about this, talk about their feelings. I guess no matter what the young man said to you, I'm delighted that he said something, that he felt secure enough to dredge it up, though it was pretty rigid and dogmatic, and lay it out in front of you. I suspect also, as a member of the clergy, you must have your own response. I suspect there are some perhaps older clergy who have been raised in a particular tradition. The theological is a nice hook upon which to lay my anxieties. A lot of lay people couldn't care less about the theology. They might read about it in Newsweek or USA Today. Their concern is change and women's roles shifting, and I'm a man, and if women's roles shift, what does that mean to be me? Should I be more manly or more female? There's a lot of issues related to this single issue.
Well, I agree with that. I think you brought out a good point. The first step in dealing with all of this from a psychological viewpoint is to be able to get it out, to get in touch with our own feelings and perhaps hidden problems, jealousies, resentments, angers, and so on that we haven't faced. So I believe that it would be good to bring that out, and that is the first step, sort of a self-examination. Everyone could look at Barbara Harris, a major event, newsworthy, it's getting a lot of press and so on, and say, how am I responding to that? I believe that that would be a healthy first step. Now, when we start to sort it out, you get positives and negatives, first of all. I mean, when you're looking at some of the negatives, you ask yourself, well, why would this young man be against all that? Well, one reason is you're simply not used to it. In fact, that was part of my response to him. I said, well, I'm not sure that, you got what your problem is with it, but it would be interesting to see how you reacted after you actually heard some women preach. And after you've functioned with women around as the leaders of the community and presiding at the Eucharist, I mean, then you'd have something to work with. So a lot of times our prejudices or the things we are against simply occur because we have no experience with them, and it's hard to imagine them ahead of time.
And I'm sure that's based to a great extent on our own experience in our formative years with gender roles, gender stereotypes, who fill the prominent female roles as we were brought up, who fill the prominent male roles, and perhaps most of his experience being with females who were not particularly inclined to speak out publicly in any forum, and sort of left it up for, quote, the man of the house, unquote. She might pollinate and excite him to get him to say what she wanted him to say, but rather the power behind the throne, so to speak.
Hard to imagine women up front and in a visible leadership role. I mean, we've seen this in the corporate world, haven't we? And I think there were many people who said they could never work for a woman boss, who found themselves with a woman as their immediate superior and have found out that they're able to cope with it. It's not the end of the world, and that maybe they even find out that it works well. But I think it gets down to the person again. I mean, if the woman who is now the boss is a good person and runs the show well and handles people well, I mean, she's probably going to get along. I mean, there'll always be some people who will be prejudiced and won't give her a chance. But again, if she's a quality person, does it well, I think there's many people who are willing to accept women in these roles if they do it well. I can think of situations where I've been in where women have preached in the church, and that the response has really depended on how good they are, very frankly. In other words, if the woman gets up and does a good job and gives a fine homily and does it well over a few times when people have heard her, there's a greater acceptance. It's simple. That's how it's broken down for me. I must say that, even speaking personally, I mean, if I was the celebrant and there was a woman preaching and her homily was really good and striking and hit home to me in one way or another, I'm very at ease with it. And I'm not sure, and if someone else is preaching when I'm the celebrant of the Mass and it's not a good homily, then I'm not at ease with it. I don't think it matters if it's male or female.
Exactly. Though the feminists bring up what I think is an appropriate issue, which sort of provides an umbrella for this. If our criteria for excellence are based on past male performance, and women are held up to this particular standard by males to act like males, so to speak. When we talk about a good female boss, is she good because she exhibits so-called male characteristics, and she has to sublimate perhaps her own natural characteristics and act male? That's tragic and not really transforming to the institution.
That's well said, and that point has to be brought out. I mean, it raises the deeper question here of the whole idea of male or female characteristics. I mean, in that debate that goes on, I mean, there's many feminists who don't want any talk of male-female differences. They feel it will get in the way, and that every time that happens, the males will define the conversation, set the category and the tone, and women will always lose whenever there's a debate like that.
And they have much historical precedence for believing that, frankly.
Of course they do.
Look at the hierarchies of the church or most corporations. I'm sure you and I are sensitive to the fact that there may be some feminists listening to us who are really not terribly pleased that two males have taken it upon themselves to discuss this issue.
Yes, that's true. Rosemary Ruther pointed that out to me, exactly why that would be, and that is the notion that any group that is oppressed or subjugated in any way, if they let the oppressors define the issue and set the agenda and lead the conversation, the oppressed group will always lose. It will always be slanted away from their best interests. And I think, again, historically, you can see why that happens. And therefore, it becomes important for women, in this case, to take hold of it themselves and to be a champion of their own cause, to set the agenda, to find the categories that fit best for them. I think there's absolutely no doubt about that. That has to happen. Excuse me. But it doesn't preclude men from entering the conversation. I think that's also part of what I don't intend to be silent about the issue.
Oh, of course.
Simply because I think women need to define it. But I think you're absolutely right in your observation. There's some women who are not happy with men sort of dominating the conversation about this issue. So we have to, I think, look at it from our male perspective, and try to see the way we
try to identify what our operating assumptions are and how stereotyped and sexist they tend to be. I'm the first one to admit that my attitudes have been formed through my lifetime by a male-dominated culture. And, I agree with you, the stereotyping of male and female characteristics is undoubtedly one of the particular problems. I feel that you and I have a right to speak out on the issue. I don't expect us to be invited any too regularly into female groups that are talking about feminine spirituality, for instance, because they do tend to see us as the oppressor historically, and I find that difficult to argue with. I don't like being excluded because I hope I'm empathic, but I also never had their experience.
That's right. It is a distinctive experience, and I mean, that'll take me back to where I do think there is a distinctive female experience in the United States, and growing up as a woman in the United States is different than to grow up as a man in the United States. I think it shapes consciousness. I think many distinctive features of women's experience shapes their outlook, and therefore I'm not really afraid to talk about male-female differences. I think when we stereotype them and force people into a Procrustean bed where they are forced to live up to certain ideal expectations. I think that's terrible and destructive. But I think that we can speak about male-female differences, and I believe that that it's precisely out of that women bring a certain outlook on being pastors and leaders in the church that is valuable. And I think that just the same way I would say that black people in the United States bring a distinctive experience to that has its own value. That is because they've known what oppression is and what it means to be excluded, and hopefully then they have a feeling for how you include people and are empathetic to those who are oppressed and downtrodden. So I believe that women do bring distinctive characteristics to the pastoring role. And you're going to get a lot of debate on that, but that's one of the reasons why I feel good about Barbara Harris being consecrated as a bishop, and why I believe that we need to have women's ordination, because I think it will enrich the mix of the leadership, that we will find different ways of being leaders. And I believe that, what you said is correct, that if we take a certain set of supposed male characteristics, stereotypical characteristics, and say that's how women are supposed to be, then, and when they're leaders, then that will foul us up completely. So then they're sitting around saying, well, I'm supposed to be efficient and hard-nosed and hard driving and get it all done and so on. I don't think that is what we're really after. And I believe some feminists are worried that this tokenism of consecrating one woman as a bishop is not going to do anything good for us in that larger picture. But what I'm trying to say is that we will, if we have males and females in leadership positions in the church, we will get a richer mixture.
Exactly, and hopefully they will be allowed to express their own characteristics exclusive of people's expectations of them. That you can be, for instance, as nurturing and socio-emotional as you are inclined, the so-called feminine characteristics, or that our assistant rector at Trinity Episcopal, a young woman, can be just as decisive and efficient and perhaps even aggressive and overbearing as she is inclined to be, and that people will accept her where she is at for whatever she is. I have two daughters, one fully grown and one who's going to be 9 in a couple of months, and particularly aware of how the world is trying to limit them in terms of what they can do and what they must be, and basically limit their repertoire of choice in terms of behavior and in terms of vocation. And for me, there's a great deal of personal sadness to that.
Yes, and I think we have to recognize, and I presume that women who rise to leadership positions, grow out of that kind of experience. It's hard for them to avoid it in some ways, and presumably they would draw on that experience to enrich their leadership roles in one way or another. Ernie, I think what we were trying to talk about here is Barbara Harris's consecration as a bishop and the psychological ramifications of all of this. And what I see so far here is we're looking at some of the negative responses. I mean, some people just don't want to look at the issue. Other people are sitting there saying they don't want to see this, and they don't want to have it because they can't imagine it working and they've never seen it. And we've got other people there who really are working out of a clear sexism. They have sexist bias and prejudice at work, which will not give women a chance to use their talents and gifts. It wants to put them in a box and keep them in a second-class status. And I think that really has to be challenged as we look at the negative responses here. Does it make sense to try to look at some of the positive responses?
Oh, yes.
I
feel
see?
remiss in not discussing those.
Yeah.
I think the consecration of Barbara is an immensely positive move in terms of providing another important access point to the church for people to engage with the church and not feel excluded, but feel the possibility of inclusion. Having female priests in the Episcopal Church for the last 12, 13 years has offered great opportunities for inclusion rather than exclusion. Historically, churches seem to have done a very good job at exclusion. And, fortunately, we're making moves to include more people based on their talents, their charisms, as St. Paul would say, rather than on their gender or economic class or some sort of expectation. So I think it's an incredibly positive move, and even as symbol, or perhaps even just as tokenism, it will offer solace and a place to go for a lot of people who previously didn't have a place to go emotionally.
That's well put. I think that it really, the consecration of Barbara Harris has offered hope to many people. There's people who have struggled for a long time to try to secure women's rights in the church. Many in the Catholic community have really not seen much progress along that line and are unhappy about it. And so I think we need a signal of hope somewhere along the line here, a sign that progress is being made. And I suspect, as with all important historical events, there is a reality about it. I mean, we've got Barbara Harris, who is now sitting at the table with those who make decisions, and will move up, as I understand it, to become the head bishop in the Diocese of Massachusetts somewhere along the line.
In a year or two, yeah.
And so we have somebody, there's a reality about it, that has a political and social reality, but it also functions symbolically. And part of that symbol is clearly positive for many people. There's many people who are rejoicing, male and female, that we've made this breakthrough, and that the Christian Church now has a woman who is understood as a successor to the apostles.
Absolutely. As I say, for me personally, it's been tremendously exciting. I think it relieves males of the problem where only males are equipped to do particular things, and I'm glad to be personally off of that hook.
That's well put, Ernie. Okay, so we've been talking about Barbara Harris, her consecration as a bishop within the Episcopal Church, and trying to look at it from a psychological viewpoint. When we do so, we find a lot of negative reactions among people. Some people don't want to look at it, and some people are upset by it. But there's also healthy, positive responses that I think need to be played up. And among those that are most important to me is the symbolic fact that Barbara Harris has now become a symbol of hope. Sign of hope for many people, males and females, who are hoping that the church can become more inclusive in its approach and thus more faithful to the teachings of Jesus.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Ernie Sibley, vestry member of Trinity Episcopal Church in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was the consecration of Barbara Harris, psychological considerations. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.